I'm Nicole Valdes. Hi there we go. Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this very important town hall this Thursday. I'm Nicole Valdes, and we are less than 1 week away from Election Day, so a lot to get to today. And I do want to introduce the faces you see on camera here. Of course, my colleague, our own Garrett Archer here, data expert, Catherine Coleman, the former Deputy Recorder for Maricopa County, and Mr. Tom Collins, the Executive Director of the Arizona Citizens Clean Elections Commission. Thank you all for joining us this morning. A lot to get to with very little time till Election Day, so I do want to go ahead and jump right in. And one thing that a lot of us have been seeing over the last few weeks is early voting. It has been a massive effort, a very enthusiastic group of voters in Arizona, especially. Garrett, I want to ask you, because as I understand it, we have been breaking early voting records almost every day since it started earlier this month. And from what I understand, we may have already surpassed the number of votes cast in the 2016 general election.
Well, we're getting there. We're very close. We've already surpassed the number of, we're very close to surpassing the number of early ballots that were cast in the 2016 general election. And we're probably days away from passing the number of ballots. 2.6 million ballots were cast in 2016. And right now we're at about 2.17. I've got a screen up from somebody who's tracking these returns, Sam Almy on Twitter. You can find this if you go on Twitter. SF Almy is the person that tracks these returns. And you can see right here, 2.17 million ballots have been cast by Arizonans already. As of right now, Democrats, people who are registered Democrat, this is not who they voted for, have a lead in the number of ballots that are being cast, 841 to the Republicans, 784. That's pretty uncharacteristic of voting in Arizona. Typically, Republicans are in the lead in voting, but we've seen across the country that flip this year. A lot of Democrats are more not only enthusiastic, but also are more willing to cast early ballots even earlier than typical, simply because of COVID-19. We see that in polling. So that's what we're seeing reflected in these numbers right now.
And I think that's an interesting point. I want to ask Catherine and Tom to join us in this conversation. And I wonder if we can talk about what that means for the future for Arizona in terms of when we'll be able to know our results and how the count is going to work here now that we have so many voters who have already cast their early ballots.
Sure. So a couple of things have changed in law for election administrators in the last couple of years that allow us to get a larger chunk of those votes that were cast prior to Election Day reported that evening. So election administrators have already started processing and counting early ballots. They have a total that they keep on a server that is secure until 8 p.m. on election night. So 1 hour after those polls close will be that first posting of election results. And the election results that are posted at 8 p.m. are always the results of early ballots that were mailed in and early ballots that came in through vote centers for voters who chose to vote in person.
And Tom, your thoughts on the number of early ballots that we have already cast, and do you think that's going to help us out when it comes down to Election Day and potentially seeing us, be able to report who won Arizona a little bit sooner than maybe we have in previous years?
Well, to take the second part of your question first, I think that all of the election administrators and officials and experts around the country have all kind of said, look, is when it comes to declaring winners of elections, I think uniformly people have urged caution about that because, at the end of the day, contrary to sort of conventional wisdom, the election, the votes must be in by 7 p.m. on election day, but counting votes is always something that can take time. It always has, and the state statutes in Arizona set up a schedule for counting those votes, reporting those totals to the state and the county and statewide canvases. So all of those things are all set forth in law. So I think that folks will be cautious about declaring winners and losers based on partial results. But I do think that with 1.4 million or so voters out of 2.6 million in Maricopa County alone, I mean, that's more than 50% of the that's more than 50% turnout right now. Turnout in a presidential year some ranges, I think, around 70 to 74%. So that's a lot of vote in. I think with some of the decisions that had to be made by the Maricopa County Recorder's Office and the Maricopa County Elections Department, around keeping folks safe and working with the vote centers, I think that does provide more flexibility for the county to basically make sure the voters have a safe experience if they choose to vote on election day.
Absolutely. And we bring that up because obviously, we had so many people who've done that already. A question we've already gotten, I want to know what happens to ballots if they're dropped off in outdoor ballot boxes. Who picks them up? Catherine, can you go ahead and answer that one?
I'd be happy to. This is a great question from Corey. The election administrators have a schedule, and it's on a daily schedule. They go and pick up from drop boxes on a daily basis so they can check in those returns, process the early ballot, signature verify the signature and the identity of the voter who voted that ballot, and then be able to mitigate any issues for that voter if the signature doesn't match or whatever it is. So that happens on a daily basis here in Arizona. Our election administrators are making sure that those boxes are monitored and securely picked up as often as possible. The ones that are in vote centers, so if you have chosen to fill out your ballot at home and you just need to drop off your ballot, you can go to any vote center in Arizona. They will have a box inside. You do not need to wait in line, and you can drop it off there. Those are also picked up on a daily basis.
Thank you. And this is really just one of the lots of questions that we've been receiving to our newsroom, I'm sure to the Maricopa County Elections Office, of people who really want to know specifics on what they need to do, when to do things, when the deadlines are on early voting. And so I want to make sure that we hit on some of those really important pieces of information for people who still have their ballots at home and haven't turned them in. And one of the most common things that I've heard from election officials is please sign the back of your early ballot. I know sometimes people, get so caught up in just filling out the ballot that they don't really see the envelope as an important part. But Tom, can you talk about why making sure that envelope is signed is so important in order to be able to verify and count somebody's vote?
Sure. So the envelope is an affidavit, which is basically a legal term that says you're swearing when you sign it that you are who you say you are and you're eligible to vote that ballot. And then that signature is what is used to compare it to your signature on file with the county to determine whether or not that ballot should be counted. So it's critical. It's also important because if a ballot is received at the county without a signature, there's no period after election day in which you can cure that, so if there is a signature mismatch, counties are required to make a reasonable effort to contact voters via phone or email if they have that information. If there's no signature on a ballot by 7 p.m. on election day, that ballot's not going to be eligible to be counted. So on the signature envelope. So it's critical, really, to make sure that you sign that affidavit.
Absolutely. Another big thing that we've been listening to is the plea to make sure that you get those ballots in as early as possible. And obviously we've seen that so many, more than 1 million voters have already done so, but drop-offs, on election day have also been talked about that could cause some delays in tabulating some of those votes. And Garrett, I know you've also been working in elections prior to coming over to us. So, I've heard this term before with election officials, late earlies, and I'd love to kind of explain to voters what that means and why waiting till election day to drop off your early ballot, if that's how you're voting, may not be the best idea, but how it'll be handled if you do that.
So as Tom just said, a late early is the exact same thing as an early ballot. As Catherine said, when you drop these things in the ballot box that is picked up every day, it goes through a process that has to be done in order to affirm that the ballot is yours, and then to make sure that everything's correct on the ballot as far as there's no weird markings, nothing that would be difficult to determine the intent of the voter. So that process is the same for every ballot. So what a late early is when on election day, when the early ballots are dropped in those drop boxes on election day, they still have to go through that same process. So what it is the more ballots that get put into those drop boxes, the longer it takes to get an official and final count of the ballot. So for example, in Arizona, when we look at what's going to happen, we will have about 75-ish% of the votes that are going to be in will be in around 8 to 8:30, depending on the county. And then as time goes on, they'll get the election day vote in, and then whatever's remaining is likely going to be the majority of those late earlies. And so if things are close, the more late earlies there are, the longer it takes to certify a count and make and have a winner.
Yep. And that's, again, one of the major topics we'll be talking about. But another one are people who are voting early and in person. And this is actually a question from someone that we just got a little bit ago, who obviously is either mailing their ballot or put in a drop box. How can you track your ballot when you mailed it in? And there's actually a couple resources that I know we've all spoken about on ways to do that. And thankfully, technology is a huge help in making sure you can do that. In Maricopa County, BeBallotReady.vote, a huge resource where you can go on there, type in just a couple of pieces of information, and pop up right there whether the county has already received your ballot, whether it's been signature verified, counted. So a lot of resources on there. But, you know, as we try to transition closer to election day, I do think it's important for people to remember that they can also check this no matter how they dropped off their early ballot, whether that be at a vote center, at a drop box, by mail. And of course, we've always had questions about the mail, the reliability, things like that. So anything else that you guys feel is important to mention as we kind of transition out of early voting and closer to election day?
Well, I think the number one thing with respect to we're talking about mail ballots, but you know it's important to stress that at this point it is no election official in Arizona would recommend mailing your mail ballot back at this point. Based on the advice that the Secretary and the county reporters received from the U.S. Postal Service, we've been recommending, and all of the election officials have been recommending, that people would have gotten their mail ballot back in the mail on the 27th. So at this point, if you have a mail ballot, you need to drop it off at a drop box or a vote center.
Great point. That is a deadline. Election officials had said October 27th was the last day they recommended anyone put their ballots in the mail to make sure it did get there by that 7 p.m. election day deadline, because as we've talked about before as well, postmarks do not count for early ballots. If your ballot is postmarked by November 3rd and it doesn't make it there by 7 p.m., unfortunately, that ballot is not going to get counted. Yeah. Still, though, early voting also happening in polls, and I know a lot of people, and record numbers there too, have been showing up to vote in person. And we've also gotten a lot of questions from people who have gone to the polls and found, again, things are different this year. I mean, obviously, we're having another election in a pandemic. The only other time we did this was earlier this year during the primary. And if voters didn't go vote during the primary and are planning to either vote now or through the weekend or on election day, they're going to notice things are different. And so I want to know if you guys can explain what we're seeing, at least in Maricopa County right now. And Catherine, I'd like to ask you this as well. We have a little bit of a different system this year. Instead of it just being a polling location, are you having to look at where your precinct is? Everyone now can pretty much vote anywhere with this new vote center model. Can you talk about what that means and whether or not this is actually a benefit to voters for this election?
Absolutely. And the recorders and board of supervisors in the state, in each county, share responsibility. So early voting is under the purview of the recorder, whereas election day and emergency voting falls under the board of supervisors. Many of those groups have gotten together this year and said, we really need to offer secure, safe locations throughout the valley for folks to be able to either drop off their ballot in person or vote in person. And so this transition to vote centers, which Maricopa County and 14 other counties have used throughout Arizona for a number of years, what this means for the voter is that on election day, you can go to any location in the Valley and either drop off or vote that ballot for you. It gives the voter a little bit more convenience, whether they need to vote near work, whether they need to vote near their child's school, or if they want to vote at home. It gives them that flexibility. It also vote centers are focused on having larger locations, which cuts down any potential exposure of poll workers and voters to COVID. And so it's very important for this year especially, and likely in future years, the voters have the opportunity to make that decision of what's best, the best way for them to vote, what's going to be safest, and what's going to keep their family safe.
Yeah, and to continue with what Catherine said also, one of the things this year that's different and better is that it's going to cut down on the number of provisional ballots. In the past, people would have to, say when we had the polling place model, if you didn't know your polling place or you went to a different polling place, you would be, there was at a time when that would cause your ballot to not count. Because they couldn't give you the correct ballot. You wouldn't be voting for the correct school district or whatever. It wouldn't be your ballot, so that ballot wouldn't count. Well, now because of the way that the system is set up, everybody's ballot counts regardless of where you vote. So this definitely has cut down on provisional ballots.
And one other thing I understand about those vote center is obviously we've seen the number of vote centers that are available this year, which is seemingly a little bit less than we saw in 2016. We didn't have this. Now we do have on election day, I'm told we will have about 125 vote centers available to voters. That is not including any drop boxes or any, I think, drive-through locations that people can still drop off those early ballots. But for people who want to vote in person, they may see that smaller number and wonder, oh my gosh, so are we going to then have to wait in longer lines because there are less places to go out there and vote? And as I'm told, Maricopa County is aware that there may be concerns about that. And each one of those vote centers, because they're larger, like Heifer mentioned, to allow for physical distancing, to allow for a lot of things that are obviously different about the way we're all living right now, they're also trying to take that into account and have more availability for more voters to get through each location. So I'm told that those vote centers could have anywhere from 9 to 15 check-in stations, 20 to 30 voting booths. That way they can actually accommodate and move voters through each location quicker, which I imagine will definitely be a benefit if we have many, thousands of voters show up to one location. Garrett, you and I have spoken about this in the past, though, with that smaller number of vote centers, we may see that the map of where they're at, in terms of, where Maricopa County voters live, and especially where people have already voted early, can be a little bit confusing. And there may be a question for those who live on maybe the outskirts of the county, how many options of places do I have at my disposal that's near me that I can actually go vote in person? And could that be an issue if they don't have as many in their neighborhood?
So going back to the early ballot screen, I want to point something out that we're talking about here. I want to look at the two turnout differences between Republicans and Democrats. You can see that Democrats have a 60% turnout right now, and Republicans have a 50% turnout right now. This will not hold. Republicans will catch up to Democrats as far as turnout. They typically are above Democratic turnout by about 5 points. They could only be even this year. That depends on Democratic turnout. But why this is important and why I'm bringing this up is that, as you can see, there's a phenomena this year in which Republicans are neglecting, or not neglecting, but deciding that they would rather vote in person. And this could impact certain vote centers because oftentimes, as we've seen across the country, there's definitely a divergence between where Republicans and Democrats live, and Republicans live in the exurbs of Maricopa County and some of the farther suburbs, and there's less vote centers in those locations. So what we're looking at is there could be a situation in which there's less vote centers servicing more voters simply because a larger portion of Republican voters who live in those precincts have decided this year that they would opt to vote in person rather than do a mail-in vote. And that could cause some clogs in the system in those exurban and far suburban vote centers.
Sure. And thankfully, there is a resource online that anyone can go to, especially if they live in Maricopa County, to find out where they can go ahead and vote. And so let me go ahead and show you guys that website here, locations.maricopa.vote. And if you can look down here, it's actually a pretty simple website. The best way that you can do it is just entering your home address right here. So I'll go ahead and, for example, put in our station website, or rather address.
I'll put it. Give me the station address. Well, there's my. Okay.
There we go. Did that work for you guys? I'm sorry. This is still. Let's see here. I'm not a robot. We're not robots here.
Yeah.
And then you can actually go ahead and filter through different kinds of options here. So what's open on the weekend? Here's the closest one to our station here. And the cool feature about this is that you'll get the address, but you can also see how many minutes, what's the wait time here? How many people are in line? And when was this last updated? You'll also get to see the hours that that location is open. So it really is a useful thing for any voter who wants to, go ahead and just check out what's closest to them, where they should be going, what time they can either go vote or drop off their ballot. And again, you can really look at filtering those options. You can even filter it just by city or open date or on the weekend. So just another resource that we've been, kind of having viewers use to go ahead and, have that option for them. But another thing here, when voters are voting in person, we've gotten a lot of questions about this from certain voters. They've seen that filling out their ballots at the polls, they're actually either using Sharpies or markers, and they've seen the ink bleed through. Catherine, are you able to talk about this and whether this is a problem or not in terms of tabulating those ballots?
Sure, it is not a problem if a voter is concerned that they have a mark that will impact them casting their ballot. They can certainly request a new one at a vote center and fill out the new ballot. But for the most part, one of the design features when Maricopa County transitioned to the new ballot and purchased the new tabulation system, cleared some of that up. So if there is a bleed through on your ballot, it is not going to affect another race on your ballot. Feel confident that you have cast your ballot correctly. And again, if you do have any concerns, then your local administrator is there to provide you a new ballot at a vote center or the recorder's office as well.
Sure. I do want to bring up a question that someone just asked us, but what if you moved? Do you vote around your new address or your old one? I believe Catherine just talked about it a little bit ago. The answer is you get to choose. You can vote anywhere across the county at any vote center. So you can look up what's closest to you, what's closest to your old address, your work, and basically decide for yourself where you'd like to go. So I do want to, continue on with, some of those talks about going to the polls. And this question is for all of you in terms of security at the polls. I think that this has been something that's been on a lot of people's minds this year, especially knowing the enthusiasm, the passion behind many of the voters this year and the political climate that we're in. Some people have noticed that there are people outside the polls, either for specific parties or things like that. Can you explain, why those people are allowed there? And if you guys are aware and understand, how things would work if there were to be incidents outside the polls, if things were to arise, what you guys, as officials understand, what is told or what is rather trained for people to do to handle those kind of problems.
Well, I guess I'll with respect to the people outside of the poll. So if you are at a vote center, you'll see signs that say this is the 75-foot mark, and what that means is that within that 75-foot area, people aren't allowed to campaign essentially or photograph within that space. So you'll often see a whole bunch of campaign signs right around that mark. So that would be presumably the last thing you might see before you walk into the voting center. But the reason why that boundary is only 75 feet is because, it's a prohibition on political speech within that boundary. So it has to be limited basically under the First Amendment. So that's the structure of the space. I'd probably have to defer to Catherine on how poll workers are handling any incidents if there are any.
Sure. So poll workers have been trained to look for and report any voter intimidation. There are some locations, polling locations, that are no electioneering sites, which means uh, outside the 75-foot, if you are on their property, you may not electioneer there either. So that there is a caveat to some of those sites where you can observe the poll. For political party observers who represent their political party, they are an important part of our process because they provide transparency and accountability. They register with their political party, they contact the recorder or elections office, and they are given a pass to enter into polling locations and monitor the process. In addition, those folks are in each of the recorder and election departments right now. They're monitoring the central count production, so the counting and processing of the early ballots. They monitor those, and any voter can actually watch that online as well. So if you're interested in watching your ballot get counted, then you can go to your local county administrator and watch the webcams as they perform those actions. And then Nicole, I did want to step back just to the last question very quickly and note that if you have moved during this voting period and you do go into a polling location, your ID or some form of legal ID needs to match your address where you intend to vote, needs to be provided on a voter identification card or on a license as well. Otherwise, you may be given a provisional ballot. So if you are choosing to choose where you vote, depending on when you've moved, make sure that your ID matches, because that's very important in Arizona.
Great point there, Catherine, and thank you for reminding us of that. Here's a question again from Dawn. Can you guys give us the website and comment section that one would go to find a voting location? And absolutely, we can include that link there for you. Again, if you live in Maricopa County, that is locations.maricopa.vote. And I know Garrett just pointed out someone else's question here. Can anyone early vote, or do you have to pre-register for that here from Kristen? Garrett, can you talk about that a little bit?
You do not have to pre-register early vote in Arizona. We do have something called the permanent early voter list, which basically puts you on a list to say, please send me a ballot every single election. But that is simply just telling the recorder to send you a ballot every single election. If you choose to vote early at any of these locations, you can go right now. In fact, a member of my family has already done that. They are not on the permanent early voter list, and yet they have already voted, simply because anyone can go in and vote early.
Absolutely. And Catherine, you were talking about poll workers here, and I've gotten this question: can anyone just be a poll worker? What are the criteria? What are the security measures in place to decide who is a poll worker, who's there, and who's actually inside the polling place, especially? And one common thing is that people have talked about whether or not anyone may try to be an observer from outside a vote center or a polling location. Is there any specific security measures, criteria to actually be declared a poll worker and be allowed inside a vote center?
So poll workers are citizens, they are voters. They volunteer to be part of the election process, but they are paid workers. So these folks are professionals, they get trained. Some of them serve during early voting. Many of them and most of them serve just on election day. In addition to poll workers, there's also troubleshooters who are more technically savvy folks who help poll workers set up, tear down, make sure that any issues throughout the day are taken care of. There's a variety of election worker jobs that can be done by our citizenry. One of the wonderful things that we have in Arizona is we allow student poll workers as well. So if you're over 16, then you can sign up to be a student poll worker. And if your teacher will give you credit, then you will get credit for that in addition to serving with the county and earning a salary that way. One of the wonderful things that has happened in this year during all of these trying times is the number of folks who have stepped up, the number of younger folks who have stepped up to say, I want to be a poll worker this year. I want to help prevent some of our aging poll workers from being exposed to COVID. So the outpouring of support this year has been amazing. Many of the election administrators throughout the state have noted that they've had an incredible amount of support, and they hope that folks continue to offer their services in future years.
Sure. I want to move on to counting of the votes, which we will see the first results pop up at 8 p.m. on election night, an hour after those polls close, and a lot of questions surrounding what those numbers will be and how they will progress over the next several hours and days. Garrett, it only seems right to ask you this question in terms of what numbers we will see on election night and whose votes are included in that first batch and what we may not see included in that until maybe several hours or even days later.
So the first batch of ballots that we're going to see on election night are the early votes, and it's going to be the vast majority of early votes. In most counties, it's going to be all the early votes. In some counties, depending on what the early vote looks like, the mail-in early vote, I should add, the postmarked early vote. In some counties, Maricopa oftentimes finishes, and sometimes they might be up to 80 to 90%, and they may have a small 10 or so % left of early votes, depending on how many come in on election day, because they won't be processing those, or a lot of them, on election day. So on election night at 8 o'clock, we're going to see the mail-in ballots. And then, and from then on till, in some cases, 3 in the morning, it really depends on the county elections department, we're going to see the election day vote. These are the votes of people who actually voted at the polling place and fed their ballot into a tabulation machine. Those are then calculated and done next. And then over the next course of the days after that, usually once a day, we will see votes coming from basically the cleanup. This is going to be the late earlies, whatever wasn't processed from the mail-in ballots on election day, just basically anything that remains. And then after that, they go to the provisional ballots and then the conditional provisionals, which is sort of the last resort. Most of those get knocked off, but there's also very, very few of those.
I think that one of the things that comes up often in every election is whether or not the ballots all get counted. In the first place, people for some reason think that if you voted a mail ballot and the election's not close, it doesn't get counted. It does get counted. If you vote a provisional ballot and the information gets confirmed for that ballot, it gets counted. So it's not as if there's no ballots left uncounted that are eligible to be counted.
Yeah, I know networks like to call elections as early as possible, statistically, but as Tom says, there is a certified canvass of results that includes every single eligible ballot, and that comes probably about, I think it's 2 weeks after the election. I don't remember the exact date, but there is a date set when it has to be done.
Sure. And I believe we also wanted to talk a little bit about what happens then when, for example, all the results are in and we start to see challenges to the results as to who won and whether or not the election is close. I know we had seen some examples of that both in 2018 and 2016. Tom, can you talk about what goes into the arguments from different sides on whether the vote's close and what may be challenged, what we could see this year?
Well, the first question that will be in order is really whether or not there's the percentage difference at the end of all this is significant, is small enough to warrant that kind of process. I mean, it's simply, the fact is that, for example, for an automatic recount, the percentage difference has to be very, very, very small. So that has happened both on initiatives and candidate races in Arizona in the recent past, but it's still not the norm. The other thing that will be happening over the 5 days after Election Day is that the county will be contacting folks who may have a mismatch in their signature and on their mail ballot. And in all likelihood, there will be efforts by parties to try to reach some of those folks. In a legal sense, one of the first things that happens if there's litigation is folks trying to make sure that ballots that might have been ruled out for one reason or another get ruled in. As Garrett and Catherine talked about, the issue with voting centers. One of the other advantages of voting centers is the majority of that litigation in the past has been about precinct versus out of precinct votes. So when you had a fixed location you were supposed to vote at, what happens to your vote if you're in the wrong place? With the voting centers in Maricopa County and in a lot of places in the state, but particularly Maricopa County, which is, that kind of litigation is, probably not going to be as extensive. So I think that, there are innumerable lawyers and a whole lot of money being raised by both political parties to litigate election results. But at the end of the day, the first question has to be whether or not there's enough votes out there to change the actual result.
Sure. And I want to get to another question from Don here. So if my address on my driver's license is not where I currently live and I go vote where I currently live, I won't be turned away. I know, Catherine, you talked about this, and it sounds like there is an option for voters when they do go vote in person that they can update their addresses and update their information. What would you say to Don here on this question?
Sure, I would ask Don or let Don know to go to the county recorder's site and make sure whichever address they want to vote at, that they have an ID that is on that list, or two forms of ID off of list 2 or 3 that that complies with that, so that they can vote. And this is very important. It gets to what Tom was just speaking about, which is there may be actions that voters need to take after election day. So once within 24 hours of the polls closing, the counties will actually start a hand count audit on the ballots so that they can verify that the results of the election are confirmed, both by a hand count and by that machine count as well. But for some voters, they need to either cure that signature. They may, if in Dawn's case, their ID doesn't match where they would like to vote, then they will vote a provisional ballot. They'll get a piece of paper from the county that describes the follow-up that they need to do and how to check the status of their ballot. So I would recommend for all voters that they are checking the status of their ballot, that they make sure that if there are any actions that they need to take, that they are taking those within the 5 days after election day. As we approach election day, the obstacles for voters do tend to get they tend to increase. And so if you are waiting to election day to vote, you are more likely to encounter one of these obstacles. And so I would encourage folks to return their ballot to a drop box very quickly. For Dawn's case, to make sure that you have some form of ID that matches where you'd like to vote. And for all voters, if you have any action that you need to take, you follow up on that with your county.
Sure. And she also asked us whether polls are open on the weekend. And I know Garrett had brought up the website earlier, but locations.maricopa.vote, you're also able to filter what sites are open on the weekend. There are a few, not all of them, that have been open for early voting. And we talked about this before we went live with Tom on emergency voting. And it sounds like that'll be going on this weekend prior to election day. Tom, can you explain a little bit about emergency voting if voters hear about that and what that means, and hopefully not to induce panic on the word emergency to anyone? Sure. This is still an opportunity for voters to vote before election day.
Right. So early voting in person ends on Friday, on October 30th. That's the deadline that the legislature has set. The legislature allows emergency early voting, but it has to be for an unforeseeable event. It's not something you should be counting on. You need to be able to explain what your emergency is in order to vote. I think that what folks ought not do is think that emergency in-person voting is a just go to the go to wherever that location is and vote just like any other polling place. You need to have an unforeseeable event that's going to prevent you from voting on election day in order to use an emergency site, because it's really for emergencies.
Sure. Now, as I understand it, that is obviously the purpose of it. Whether or not, voters have to go in and explain or have some kind of proof that there is an emergency, I think is something that's been discussed. Does anyone have any kind of insight on that part of it?
I mean, the only site is you have to be able, and my understanding is, and obviously I'm open to correction from Catherine or Garrett on this, but my understanding is you have to be able to articulate what the emergency is. I don't believe you have to have a documentary proof of the emergency. That said, those laws have changed between 2018 and now. And so, whether or not, that's going to become something that gets litigated over or fought about, I mean, I hate to be lawyerly about it, but that's sort of how those things play out. But essentially what the legislature said after 2018 was, look, you have to have a real emergency in order to vote at an emergency location.
Sure. And we just got about 5 more minutes, so I do want to end this on the conversation of when and how long could we have to wait to find out who wins Arizona's vote? And I know that this has been a huge question among voters, among us, in terms of all the different factors that go into not only being able to finalize that count, the days that it takes. Let's start with Catherine, if you can talk about some of the things that impact how soon we'll be able to know who wins Arizona when it comes to, like you mentioned, ballot curing, the late early ballot drop-offs, as well as the data from poll workers. As I understand, they have to manually bring that to the elections office to kind of go ahead and count all the votes that were tabulated at each vote center. Is that correct?
That's correct. So starting at 8 p.m., that first release of ballot information on election night are all of those early ballots that were processed and counted prior to election day. And then, Nicole, as you said, in Arizona, we do not transmit things electronically. So we are counting on poll workers to bring those data packs back to the county so that they can be uploaded into the server. And that's when you'll start seeing those results from election day start trickling in. As the night progresses, that those results will continue, and poll workers will be bringing back large tubs full of mail-in ballots, those late earlies that we talked about earlier that were dropped off on election day. Election workers, they actually work all the night to count those in the office. It's an incredible bonding experience if you ever get to spend 8 hours going through late early mail until the truck picks it up at 6 o'clock in the morning on Wednesday after election day, and then those start to get processed. So as soon as those are scanned and they can be signature verified, then the ballots are opened and they are counted. And that has to happen in that series. So it does take a couple of days to make sure that all of those ballots are counted. And we are expecting Arizona to close out their results within 10 days after the election, though, if not sooner.
Absolutely. And that's the one thing I've heard from everyone.
Impacted is the closeness of those races is really going to impact the results as well. So the number of ballots come in that are late earlies, and then how big those margins are between candidates will really drive how long you're watching those results towards the end.
I think that, one of the things that Garrett mentioned, and I think you'll hear this. I mean, you're not going to hear any election officials in Arizona declare a result until the final result, and you really never do. If the people who declare results, as Garrett said, are members of the press, and I mean, I myself was a political reporter once upon a time, and I remember the first edition of the paper, the competing paper on election night in 2000 said it's Bush. And the second edition said, "Is it Bush?" Who were around in 2000. There's still an eagerness on the part of any media organization to be first. And so I would simply advise folks, if you're on the internet, watching television, all those kinds of things, those calls that are made, you know, are going to include projections. They're going to include a lot of things, and you're going to also see a lot of folks on the internet who are making claims, just as you have throughout the election, that are not backed up by facts. So, you know, we would, you know, just encourage you folks to, you know, keep track of the Maricopa County Recorder's website, keep track of the Clean Elections website, azcleanelections.gov, the Secretary of State's website. That's where you're going to find the actual information about what's going on with the counts and with the actual totals. And be a little wary as you hear folks jump into, you know, what they think the result is going to be.
Sure. Tom, I got to have you end there because we do have no more time left, but thank you all for joining us. Again, one last message is just be patient. We will have the results within hopefully a few days here in Arizona, but thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.